Where are you?
Me? I'm from Israel.
Where?
Israel.
You are welcome.
thank you so much. انت كنت في بانوراما اكتوبر؟ شفته؟
شفته.
شفته اوكي. وشو رايك؟ شو رايك؟ ممتاز؟ The outside presents Egyptian and Israeli weapons. There's an Israeli tank that was captured in the Sinai, and it's on display here in the museum. While inside is a series of video screenings.
How Egyptians resisted defeat and prepared for the war of revenge and victory, and the various strategies used in surprising the enemy up until the victorious end.
So it's quite crazy. I'm in the hall here, and a really nice clerk gave me a private show. This is usually for groups reserved, and they were very nice and came here and showing me this display. This is showing the generals that were participating on the Egyptian side, giving a bit of a biography of them. The Egyptian soldiers, there's the crossing of the canal and the boats, and here are displayed these captured Israeli soldiers. You see here the helmets, Star Blue. So this is very interesting because there's basically an ancient Egyptian with a bow and arrow, and underneath him modern Egyptian, a pilot and soldiers. So the museum is showing all of the Egyptian military prowess throughout the ages, going back from the pharaohs through, you see here, Napoleon invading Egypt. There's a part on that. Alexander the Great, Crusaders. Everything kind of tied into this. So now these gentlemen taking me to see the movie display, and it's a private show because there's nobody here.
No.
So yeah, here. This is the display hall. Huge screen. I am ready. Yes, thank you. Let's see the movie.
مدفعي مكثف ضد مواقع العدو في سيناء على امتداد الجبهة وفي العمق.
My God. Water splashing on me, special effects inside this hall.
ضد العدو الإسرائيلي والخسائر الجسيمة التي تلحقها بها. قامت الطائرات الإسرائيلية
كتير فيديو. فكرت فيديو 5 دقايق. So that was just one of several displays. So going up here, another movie. Movie number 2. So let's see. So this panorama section is basically dedicated to the Egyptian crossing of the Suez Canal, which definitely was an impressive military achievement and the portion of the war where they had their early successes. So as you would expect,
the Israeli tanks in a desperate attempt to halt the process of liberation counterattacks. One of the fiercest and largest tank battles since World War II breaks out.
so that was it. 3 displays, each of around 20 minutes. The last one didn't work, so an hour in total, showing really only the first part of the war, because that was the part where the Egyptians had their successes. And there is definitely an element here of sort of glorifying Egyptian military accomplishments over millennia, going back to the ancient Egyptians, fighting crusaders, and then lastly fighting the Israelis. Basically, according to the Egyptians, they say they won. So they talked about the Egyptian victory, despite the Israeli troops being on the way to Cairo when the ceasefire was signed. They said they liberated the Sinai Peninsula, which they didn't do in the war. Israel held on to the Sinai Peninsula and handed it over to Egypt as part of the peace agreement that was signed in 1979. And that also was somewhat missing here in this museum. They could have talked a little bit about kind of the process afterwards of reconciliation after this bloody war, when both sides realized that they couldn't go on like this, that led to the signing of the historic peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. So I would say definitely a bit of a missed opportunity here. For the record though, in war there are no winners, everybody loses. It's now been 50 years since the Yom Kippur or October War between Israel and Egypt, and almost half a year since I filmed that scene, which was just a small part of a larger video, but it was sort of the most political element of a blog that is primarily a travel video. And it did spark a lot of reactions from Egyptians who said, "We won the war, how could you say otherwise?" So I want to discuss that issue a little bit here in this video. And first of all, I want to say, and I don't know how much this comes across sort of sincerely through the camera, I don't really care. I don't really care who, quote, won or lost a war that took place 50 years ago before I was born. But there was one type of remark in the comment section which did disturb me a little bit. And I'll get to that in a moment if you bear with me. But first I want to talk about not what happened during the war, but rather what happened after the war. So this is what the map looks like when the ceasefire was signed on the 25th of October, 1973. We can see that it's quite similar to what it was before the war, when the Suez Canal was the border between the two sides, although there are some Egyptian forces on the east side of the canal and there are some Israeli forces on the west side of the canal. So the first thing that needed to be done was to disentangle these forces and make sure that hostilities don't break out again. Israeli and Egyptian commanders met at what's called Kilometer 101, which is the farthest point west beyond the canal of the Israeli forces. And they were able to agree to sort of maintain the ceasefire, but not anything beyond that. And this is where the American mediation stepped in, led by the US Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who through very intense and difficult negotiations managed to hammer out 3 months later, on January 1974, a more substantial agreement, the Israeli-Egyptian Disengagement Treaty, also known as Sinai 1. And there were a bunch of articles in this agreement. You can see here the first article that talks about line A, east of which will be the Israeli forces, and line B, west of which will be the Egyptian forces. And there were a bunch of other articles with more lines and demilitarized zones and so forth. It's not that important for this video. You can see the full agreement that I've linked in the description below. But what's important is that this agreement held, and therefore, a year and a half later, on September 1975, another agreement was signed. The Israel-Egypt Interim Agreement, also known as Sinai 2. And this again talks about positions of forces. There will be a UN force in the middle, buffer zone, demilitarized zone, American observation posts in the Sinai that can warn Israel of potential attack. But it also goes a bit beyond that. Just take a look, for example, at the opening to the agreement. The conflict shall not be resolved by force, but by peaceful means. The agreement constitutes a first step towards a just and durable peace. The sides are determined to reach a final and just peace settlement by means of negotiations, called for by Security Council Resolution 338, this agreement being a significant step towards that end. And there are also elements of cooperation. The parties hereby establish a joint commission for the duration of this agreement. Non-military cargoes destined for or coming from Israel shall be permitted through the Suez Canal, and so on. The full agreement is in the description below. We can see that this is another step in the progression towards more normal ties between the two countries. And again, we see that after this agreement held, that the process went further. Anwar Sadat showed his willingness for direct negotiations. He famously flew to Jerusalem, gave his speech in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and then the negotiations were launched, mediated by the United States. Took around 2 years. Egypt demanded the return of the Sinai Peninsula as part of a full peace treaty, and Israel, a bit reluctantly at first, eventually agreed. And on the 26th of March 1979, 5.5 years after the end of the October War, the two sides signed a peace treaty, and Israel agreed to give the land back to Egypt as part of that wider treaty, which again had many articles. And if you want to see the full complex treaty, you know where to find it. So, still, Israel had to withdraw from the territories, and that took around 2 years in stages, with the final stage being completed on April 1982. 8 years, more than 8 years after the end of the war. And this brings me back to the comment that was problematic, which says that we liberated the Sinai Peninsula. The Egyptians saying they took the Sinai Peninsula in the war from Israel. They defeated Israel in the war and they took back their lands by force. And this is what others need to do as well. The Palestinians, Hezbollah, whoever it is. War with Israel and take your lands. And in this case, we see the opposite. We see the process that was just laid out, which was a very intense negotiation mediated by the United States and other powers, and at the end of which Israel handed over peacefully the territory to Egypt many years after the war concluded. What happened during the war, whether that influenced negotiations and so forth, I'm not getting into that. It's possible. But in the end of the day, there was a very intense diplomatic process, and the handing over of the territory by Egypt was part of a wider agreement which included recognition of Israel and a full peace treaty. And I wish that that was emphasized a little bit in the museum, and it was just absent, and I gave my criticism of that when I visited there. It is possible, based on what we saw here, to get something out of Israel through negotiation and not just through smashing it in war. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I mean, Anwar Sadat is a very admired and respected figure around the world, and also in Israel, because of what he did, and I think Egyptians can be proud of that. I am not trying to insult the Egyptian military or army in this video. I think the Egyptian soldiers fought bravely. Many of them gave their lives for the cause. It's not something that I take lightly. The crossing of the Suez Canal was a very impressive military achievement, but it's not what ultimately brought the Suez Canal or the Sinai Peninsula back under Egyptian control. That happened after the negotiation process, and it was handed over by Israel peacefully. That's all I have to say about that. For my full perspective on Egypt, I really suggest that you watch the full video. That was really just a very, very small part of the video. There's a lot more to it. And if you're watching and you're not one of the two parties, Israel and Egypt, then also please check out the video, and hopefully that will inspire you to visit Egypt. It's an amazing, beautiful, fascinating country with so much history, so many interesting things going on there. It's really a place that I recommend that you have to go visit. So please check out the video. Now, that really is it. Thank you for sticking through to the end. I'll see you around.